Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Today we are talking with Nicole Mellow about her new book, co-authored with Jeffrey Tullis, The Legacies of Losing in American Politics. Nicole Mellow is professor of political science at Williams College. She is the author of the book, The State of Disunion. Nicole, if I may, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
All right, so the legacies of losing in American politics. Who are the beautiful losers that we need to learn more about?
The beautiful losers. Well, we focus on three losers in particular. The first being the AntiFederalists, who lost the effort to defeat the Constitution, lost the ratification battle. The second loser is President Andrew Johnson, who was chased out of office during Reconstruction. And then the third loser is Barry Goldwater. So we cover the in the 1964 presidential race. So we try to cover the gamut of American political history.
Okay.
And I can tell you a little bit about why we focus on those losers, if that's
sure. Go ahead. Yes.
So each of those for us represent what we call an anti-moment. They're anti-moments to the moments that are often noted by scholars of American political history and I think in the general public as well as moments of significant change in American politics. So there's the founding, there's Civil War and Reconstruction, and then there's the New Deal. And for scholars of American political history, these are these sort of transformational moments, these constitutional change moments that are described as kind of leap forwards in this narrative of American political history. And so those instances are what prompted us to look at the particular, the sort of the big losers in those contests and to say, yes, they were undisputably lost in those moments, the ideas that they were promoting, the policies that they were promoting. But as it turns out, those losses were actually very significant, and they paved the way. They helped to initiate subsequent successes for all of those the causes that were promoted. So we call them anti-moments. Okay. We also call them losers, but they're losers that become winners.
Okay, so you start with the Anti-Federalist, and I ask you this question. It'll be a basic question. It'll sound like one, but from my knowledge of the Anti-Federalist, it invites an answer of multiple parts. So who are the Anti-Federalists, and what are they about? And I think you attribute the book, you and your co-author, to Herbert Storing. And Herbert Storing has this sort of four-part answer as to why we would pay attention to the Anti-Federalists, and are they relevant? Now, of course, you're arguing that they are relevant, so maybe help us understand why they're significant.
Yeah, so for us, the Anti-Federalists are really interesting. I mean, it's obviously a diverse group of individuals who were we describe it as a social movement that was of individuals who some were supportive of features of the Constitution and opposed to other features. Some were opposed to the Constitution in its entirety. What together they make is a group who was committed to defeating ratification of the Constitution. They were alarmed at what they thought the Constitution would bring. And the point that we try to underscore with the Anti-Federalists is that both Federalists who were promoting the Constitution and the Anti-Federalists who were opposed to its ratification were in agreement as to what was being undertaken and what the Constitution would bring, right? That it would bring this new regime, that it was a significant change, and that this would not only be about introducing a new type of political regime, but that it would bring with it a more commercial economy in which agrarian practices were secondary to a more vibrant urban commercial economy that would also induce cultural change, that would bring changes in the mores and the habits of the citizenry. And so they both agreed that that's what was at stake. The Federalists, of course, were promoting it, and the Anti-Federalists were opposed to it. And so for us, they're significant because they made a very aggressive and well-constructed and sort of persuasive case to a citizenry that was skeptical about massive change at the time. And because of the strength of their case, the ways that Federalists had to respond to mollify the citizenry, to sort of tamp down fears is part of why Anti-Federalists eventually became as successful as they were.
Are the Anti-Federalists a coherent group? Are they? I mean, what's the range of claims they make against the new Constitution?
Well, I mean, they're not a coherent. They're coherent, as we suggest, in their effort to defeat ratification, and for us, that's the significant part. But different Anti-Federalists, of course, had different concerns. Some were concerned about the rise of the sort of resurrection of a monarchical-like president. Some were concerned about the supremacy of the national government over the sovereignty of the states. Some were concerned about the likelihood of a standing army. Some were so concerns varied, but the concerns were grave enough, and the anticipation of what was to come was shared broadly enough that motivated the coherency of an argument against ratification.
So, and you make the point too. I mean, the central structural change is a federal government that can regulate citizens directly and no longer just through the states. States are no longer the principals, rather it's individual citizens are the principals, and you make that point.
Yes. And it's interesting. I mean, your mention of the federal government reminds me of one of the things that we try to point out, and I haven't gone into much detail about this yet, but so one of the arguments that we're making, right, is that Anti-Federalists lay out the case for why this is really a departure and what this will bring. And Federalists respond by saying, no, in fact, what we're proposing is not that different. It's familiar. It's sometimes being practiced, depending on what they were talking about. It's sometimes being practiced in the states. These are not as radical a departure as they seem.
Yeah.
And then our argument is that Federalists later go on in the Federalist Papers to make actually sophisticated defenses of the very things that they said they weren't about, and that this rhetorical shift, this sort of mollifying rhetoric followed by kind of a subtle defense of the thing that Anti-Federalists said that they were about in the first place, is what enables subsequent, once after ratification, is what enables subsequent Anti-Federalists and heirs to the Anti-Federalists to point back to that early mollifying rhetoric and claim that this is what to interpret the Constitution in a way that is at odds with the logic that they both understood early on. So one of the sort of rhetorical, we talk about this as a politics of appropriation, but one of the points that I just wanted to make that we make is that even from the very sort of naming, right, when the Federalists claim for themselves the label of Federalists, really, they should have been called nationalists, right? Because that was what their project was about. But by claiming the name Federalists, they force Anti-Federalists into a name that denies their fundamental aim, which is to preserve a true Federalist system, right? A true state and national power.
Now, I read your book, and now listening to you here, the thought that comes to mind is that's really a Hegelian mouthful. So let's maybe unpack that a little bit. How do we know? I mean, there's all sorts of questions that come to mind. As I was reading your book, how do we know what's an authentic Federalist constitutional argument versus what I think you suggest that it's either disingenuous or mollifying or an inauthentic argument about federal power under the new Constitution as voiced by the Federalists?
That's a good question. I think that what we can see is that there are, the way that we try to do it in the book is to read through on whichever topic, take federalism or states' rights, to read through the argument that is made by the Federalists in the Federalist Papers to first suggest that, well, if you look, for example, at the power that is distributed to the federal government versus the state governments, you'll see that in all of these ways, there is sovereignty. There's essentially dual sovereignty, right? There's sovereignty held by the states. There's sovereignty held by the national government, and so you shouldn't be worried that this is an accretion of power to the national government in the way that Anti-Federalists are charging us with.
Okay.
But then subsequently in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton will go on to argue that, people are loyal to their state government, they're loyal to their local government because they're familiar with it. That will help to buttress the defenses for robust state power. But he also concedes that the only thing that would switch them from this is if the national government were better administered.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, and of course it's true that the national government will be better administered for all of these reasons. So it's readings like that help us to make the claim that this is what Federalists are about. In first mollifying and then subtly defending actually a more robust argument.
Yeah, no, I that argument intrigued me as I was reading your book, and but one thing that came to mind, and also I think what comes to mind too in your favor is, or in favor of this reading is, this idea of Publius says at different times. Of course, the federal government will be the arbiter that decides on these jurisdictional claims between federal and state powers, and and then there's also this idea in Federalist 46 of the common constituents. And it will be the common constituents where ultimately there's this decision that has to be made at different points. Where will powers be lodged? There's no, final abstract constitutional dividing point. It's going to be a contest. Which brings to my thinking about the New Deal and the powers of the New Deal. It seems to me the voters have largely accepted and acquiesced in a federal government of incredibly large powers. And they've just sort of, the common constituents there have made that decision. But that's not to say under various events and stresses that those powers cannot be returned to the state governments or stripped from the federal government in due course. I mean, it's sort of an ongoing contest.
That's exactly right. There's nothing, and in fact, in many cases, the more proper administration or the more proper determination about policy might be at the state and local level, right? But that it is an ongoing conversation.
But now here's my question to you. Everyone's an originalist now, as I've learned, except even people trying to make interesting arguments have to sound like originalists. So are Tullis and Mellow an originalist of sorts? That is to say, your originalism is a high Federalist, authentic. We have to decide the genuine, authentic Federalist arguments, and then that's really the standard that we have to use in constitutional interpretation. Because as one of the thoughts that I had is, as I'm listening to you here and reading your argument in the book, AntiFederalist versus the Federalist, and the Federalists are mollifying the Anti-Federalists, they're accepting them, and they're not accepting them, and this all gets really complicated. But of course, it could just be, this is politics, and it's already a big country in the early republic. It's a diverse country. There are different regions, economic interest at play, and there's just a process going on of Federalists realizing that they may have reached too far. They've got to draw it back. They've got to bring more people in because it's a supermajority to get the Constitution ratified. So they've got to bring them in. But that, to my mind, does that mean when Tullis and Mellow say there are disingenuous readings or different tactics that are used by the Federalists, but is that to suggest there's an authentic reading of the Constitution, or in my mind is this is sort of a political document that has to be hammered out by the people, and Anti-Federalist arguments are a part of that, and we have to take them into consideration?
Yeah, it's a really, I like both your phrasing and the question. So I don't think that, for us, our interest, so what I can say with certainty that we would say is that we do see a particular, what we describe as a political logic of the Constitution that both sides agreed on, that would unfold that had the tendency to unfold in particular ways, in ways that what we're really interested in doing is describing in better understanding the history of U.S. political development. So we're not particularly interested in making some sort of originalist claim, to use your words, in any sort of formation, except that we do think that there is a political logic to the Constitution. What we hope to do by pointing out the success of Anti-Federalists in after ratification, reinterpreting the Federalist Papers, and this includes Jefferson. It comes to include Madison, right? In reinterpreting the Federalist Papers to make the case for something that might harken back, in fact, to the Articles of Confederation. That is a tremendous political success, and that really helps to explain. Mm-hmm. As we continue down the road of American political development, this really helps to explain a lot of the political outcomes that have obtained over time. And so we treat it as what we're interested in doing is describing a more multifaceted political history and developmental course than has traditionally been done by sort of progressive historians or by those who see a kind of clear march in these constitutional moments. So I don't know if that will exactly answer your question, but I think that what we want to do is to restore to our political history the vibrancy of the Anti-Federalist interpretation that is often not claimed or acknowledged as the Anti-Federalist interpretation.
One of the questions I had, Anti-Federalist claims about the Constitution, and you say those are drawn upon, and we can see them being drawn upon. I think you don't talk a lot about Andrew Jackson, but I just interviewed someone on my show who just wrote a book on Andrew Jackson, so he's kind of in my mind. Andrew Jackson, in certain respects, I think would have drawn on Anti-Federalist claims. He's certainly a big moment in terms of presidential power, and also thinking about the bank and that question of constitutional interpretation. And you hit on Andrew Johnson relying on Anti-Federalist arguments. You hit on Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, and indeed I think most of the post-war conservative movement. And it just sort of sparked this question: how would these arguments, though, have emerged? Anti-Federalist arguments, that is, have emerged in the early republic? Are you saying it's through the Federalist Papers? Like, what's the historical causality that would have put these out there?
So I think certainly the writings of the Anti-Federalists, and I'm not sure that I'm fully getting the question, but
how would Anti-Federalist arguments have shaped statesmen's minds in the early republic, such that they would have drawn on them in the manner you're suggesting?
So I think by making the argument for more robust power at the state level, for the states' rights argument, becomes something that, and making that a legitimate, I mean, this is, again, part of what we try to underscore is the sort of subtle but profound anti-federal success by reinterpreting or offering up an interpretation of the Constitution based on some features of the Federalist Papers that really make the argument that the Constitution is a document of in favor of limited government and a profoundly states power government. That was an ideological resource for subsequent actors. So in our case, Andrew Johnson is the next case that we take up.
Yeah. And
so much of his argument against radical Republicans who were interested in Reconstruction and imposing a sort of formidable national power, much of the argument that he made was that what the South had lost in the Civil War was the issue of slavery and the issue of secession, but that they had not ceded anything in terms of the right of the states to determine their own economic order, their own racial order, and that these things were justly constitutional, and that so what radicals were in Congress were attempting was extra constitutional in prosecuting the Reconstruction agenda. So for us, he had those ideological resources in that strain of anti-federalist argumentation about the Constitution as a states' rights document.
Question, the Federalist Papers figure prominently in your argument in terms of anti-federalist arguments and or in terms of how Federalists incorporated and then later challenged, as you say, anti-federalist arguments. What about the Constitutional Convention? I was thinking about that as I was reading your book. And, the well-known fact, the Virginia plan is substantially modified. Madison loses over 40 different times in the convention on proposals he initiates. Do the Anti-Federalists really emerge there? And also thinking about the state ratifying conventions as well. Madison suggests if you really want to understand the tenor of the Constitution, it's in the state ratifying conventions.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that the focus, one of the things that we would that we try to underscore is the hurdles that existed for Federalists coming out of the convention, right? That that in some ways the fact that they were able to secure ratification is really outstanding, right? And that is why it's considered to be such a big win, because the forces of status quo, or the forces against them, were so substantial. And I think that for us, the reason we focus on the Federalist Papers is because you see the articulation of a campaign that is designed precisely with the knowledge of the hurdles that are faced in front of them, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. Is reading your book, one of the fun things I've done at Liberty Fund is I've attended week-long conferences on the constitutional ratification debates. And, a quote came to mind as I was reading your book and thinking about, well, when would these sorts of state sovereignty arguments or rights of states to govern themselves and these sorts of claims. And I remembered a quote because it was explained to me in this way. It's John Dickinson to James Madison. It's a crucial point in the convention, almost a turning point, when Roger Sherman, among others, is they're starting to, the convention almost reaches an impasse, and they're really starting to turn against Madison's plan. And, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania says to Madison, to get your reaction to this quote, I'm blanking on the date. He says this to Madison, but this is in the Philadelphia Convention, 1787. Quote, "You see the consequence of pushing things too far. Some of the members from the small states wish for 2 branches in the general legislature and are friends to a good national government. But we would sooner submit to foreign power than submit to be deprived in both branches of the legislature of an equality of suffrage, and thereby be thrown under the domination of the larger states." As I thought about that quote, and then thinking about what's about to come, which is equality of the states in the Senate, not to mention other ways equality of the states manifests itself in powers and operations of the Constitution. It's almost like the Anti-Federalists emerge quite early and have to be addressed and brought into the conversation in a way Federalists don't want to, but yet there it is.
Yeah, I mean, and the sort of admonition, you see what happens when you push too far.
Yeah, it's a great.
I think that that tenor is clearly there throughout, which is why these sort of rhetorical, sort of sophisticated rhetorical argumentation of the Federalist Papers, it takes on an even more heightened salience, right? That it was Federalists knew what they were up against, right? And again, the sort of audaciousness of what they were trying in that particular political moment, and with the seriousness of the charges that were being levied against them. It really is a sort of remarkable moment, isn't it?
Yeah. No, question for you on the Federalists and Anti-Federalists interplay in the Federalist Papers. What about James Madison in the bank? Now, he's certainly a Federalist, but goes to great lengths to argue the incorporation of a national bank violates the enumerated powers of the Constitution and can't be squared with the necessary and proper, the so-called sweeping clause language in Article 1, Section 8, and holds to this view throughout his time in public life, up until the point where he discards it. But it's interesting, as you know, I'm sure, the way he explains that. He says he hasn't given up on his personal view that it's unconstitutional, but that the people in the legislature through the representatives, accepting a national bank, have expounded the Constitution, and thus it has become constitutional, and he gives way to their judgments. I mean, there's one question, I think, for Tullis and Mellow: how does one expound a Constitution within your framework? But also, Madison seems to be very complicated, and he himself seems to have been perhaps convinced by the Anti-Federalist arguments in the course of time.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting point. I think when you're talking about expounding the Constitution, that goes back to the earlier political logic that we were talking about, of these the sort of the capacity for the Constitution to invoke this kind of developmental logic that is by no means prescribed, but is certainly the resources and power is there in the national government if it is so determined that that is necessary and proper, and the way that that national power should be developed, that the resources are there. But I think Madison is an interesting figure in particular because he does, I mean, in a sense, his position as a Federalist defending ratification and his authorship of the Federalist Papers makes him the ultimate, it's part of what makes the anti-federal interpretation, subsequent interpretation, or what we sometimes call the heirs of the anti-federalist persuasion as you get farther down the historical path. It's his authority that makes that argument so persuasive, right? He is a Federalist. He was one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, and yet we can now invoke him. And in fact, there's ways that he, in later years, is more sympathetic to that cause and making that argument. So he's in some senses the ultimate authority, right? It is his role in particular that makes him such a authorizing voice in that anti-federal persuasion.
Yeah, so I guess as I thought about that, I mean, as I thought about your claims about the political logic of the Constitution, it just sort of seemed there was, with Madison, I mean, there's tension there.
Yeah, exactly.
There's tension there, and it seems to me, I think one level is, can the necessary and proper clause actually defeat what I think to be the structure of the Constitution? That is to say, the means to the enumerated powers can be read as unlimited because of that clause, even though we have enumerated powers, in which case perhaps you've defeated the Constitution. I think that was Madison's point. I think that was Jefferson's point. But you would seem to suggest maybe the Federalist logic is the necessary and proper is an open-ended claim.
That's right. The sort of argument being, yes, that the purpose of government is limited, but the powers to accomplish those purposes must be unconstrained. And in fact, hence the necessary and proper clause, but in fact, the purpose of national government, according to the political logic of the Constitution, might change over time as new circumstances warrant, and that's where you get the possibility for both new purposes, broader purposes, if they're so decided, and the power to accomplish those with the necessary and proper clause. But I think Madison, to return to your point, Madison and Jefferson as well, both invoke early Federalist paper rhetoric about something like federalism, for example, and ignore some of the later Federalist paper rhetoric as part of their defense of an anti-federal reading, and that I think is significant and something that we try to recognize as part of what fortifies the anti-federal reading.
Thinking about, that's interesting. So that seems to suggest to us, I think people hear it say, Jefferson, Madison, right? I mean, these are key founders. This isn't just John Dickinson, or this isn't just Richard's favorite, Roger Sherman, or something like that. These are key guys. And it to me, it comes back to a question I asked you earlier of kind of a capital P politics that Anti-Federalist claims themselves are a part of the Constitution. And it seems to me significant in light of your arguments about Andrew Johnson, and I think later conservative figures in the 20th century, because I took it at times what you guys were saying is there's something disingenuous about these arguments that Johnson and modern conservative, they don't really know what they're doing. They don't really know that they're appealing to these thinkers who weren't really a part of the right understanding of the Constitution. And so, maybe we should see them with different glasses. Is that part of your argument in the book?
I think what we would, or at least what I would offer instead, is that what we should do is give the Anti-Federalists their due, that they have been, part of the big project of the book is to say these political actors who did engage in capital P politics and who, because we have a narrative in American politics and politics in general, right? There are winners and there are losers. There are the victors and there are the defeated. But that really this is a simplistic way to think about politics. And so those that we have relegated, like the Anti-Federalists, earlier you mentioned talking about Anti-Federalists with high school teachers. It wasn't until college that I encountered the Anti-Federalists, and I think they have been relegated to the dustbin of history erroneously. And that's part of what we're trying to rectify, is to say that they were not losers. They were a part and parcel of forming the rich political culture that exists in the U.S. and that has, over time, we talk about a sort of braided strand of constitutional and anti-constitutional argumentation, and just thinking about it in a more complicated way than a narrative of these series of victors versus these series of losers.
So thinking about another beautiful loser, Andrew Johnson, talk about how he loses well.
So
or maybe that's not the way to put it, but you can. You know.
He loses well, yes. So he's an interesting figure, in part because, he was virtually impeached. He acquitted by one vote. He was chased out of office. He was massively derided and disliked as Lincoln's successor after Lincoln's assassination. And yet he accomplished, and he doesn't fit our traditional model of leadership, right? He is someone who's typically dismissed as ill-advised, wrong-headed, incompetent, with different derogatory or dismissive terms. But in fact, what we argue that he did was to really build the space for the South to return to the Union and to establish the political order and the types of economic and social practices that they believed they had not lost just because they had lost the Civil War. And so we talk about his leadership style as one of preemption, where he tried to impose a more lenient restoration plan in the aftermath of the Civil War than what radical Republicans in Congress wanted. He hoped to put the South back on its feet economically and politically more quickly, and that's why he pursued this more lenient restoration plan. He obstructed once Congress got wise to his ways and were disappointed in his leniency and tried to instruct him with legislation. He willfully misexecuted much of the legislation that they passed. And so through these different types of things that we don't typically celebrate as leadership styles, right? Preemption, obstruction, these sorts of things. He helped to secure time for the South to rebuild itself, to restore itself in the ways that that Southern states wanted to. And he helped to lend, going back to the question of ideology that we were talking about, or rhetoric, he helped to restore a line of defense rhetorically in ways that he sort of repurposed some of that anti-federal rhetoric as a defense of Southern states' prerogative to determine their own economic and social or racial order.
So am I, it seems to me as I read the Johnson, which is a very interesting chapter, Johnston uses anti-federalist arguments to help rebuild a racial caste system in the South, caste system in the South.
That's right. That's
okay.
right.
Yeah, so that's...
Yeah.
And you're saying, but that's not anti-federalist ideas as such. That's how they were put to use.
That's right. That's right. That he drew on this rhetorical tradition and repurposed it in ways that served the ends that he was seeking. And so this is where, right, Johnson is typically seen as just a terrible president who's chased out of office. And then separately, there's the emergence of the Jim Crow South, the defeat of Reconstruction and the emergence of the Jim Crow South, subsequent emergence of the Jim Crow South. And what we're trying to argue is that the things that he did, including repurposing of anti-federal argumentation, as well as preemption and obstruction, helped to facilitate that and helped to realize it down the road in ways that are not appreciated. That in fact his vision is what occurred for and lasted for something like 100 years, right?
Yeah. So thinking about, it's interesting as I was reading your chapter, is Johnson, because another view of Reconstruction, as you know, is the radical Republicans are overreaching. And as I've read, some have argued and drawn analogies, I think maybe to recent American foreign policy experience, there's almost an element of nation building with
Right.
Reconstruction. And as we know, nation building tends to fail unless you drop a bomb on someone or, carpet bomb their cities and split their country into two pieces. Usually it doesn't work, and, democracies get tired of this because it's dirty work, and the North gets tired, and Johnson is sort of reacting against that. So the Anti-Federalist arguments, but there's also a radical Republican element here, I think, that may be, as I've read different accounts at the time, too dismissive of federalism, too dismissive of the rights of states to govern, and indeed that you really can't remake social, political, cultural orientation of a people unless you're willing to do a lot of dissavory things.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the points that we make is that, and this was part of the charge that Johnson levied at radical Republicans, was that they were overreaching, that they were going outside of the Constitution and trying to impose their vision in ways that were not constitutional, that were not legitimate. And this is how he positioned himself as a defender of the Constitution in some famous speeches. I think that there's both that ideological component, and then there was also, as you suggest, the political component, which is that because he was so successful in resisting their initiatives, and because they were therefore forced to increasingly instruct and try to constrain him with legislation, Northern audiences grew weary of this, right? It ultimately sapped the power of radical Republicans in Congress because they had to keep justifying their ever extensive legislative instruction and their consistent overriding of his vetoes and their consistent sort of ratcheting up of the pressure in ways that I think a Northern audience felt, we fought the Civil War, we've completed the battle. We're tired of doing this, right?
Yeah.
To your point about kind of nation building.
It's interesting. It's new to me, and maybe you can talk about this. You attribute the idea of a race-neutral constitution originating with Andrew Johnson in response to radical Republican legislation.
Yeah, I think, and this is one of the questions that we've deliberated over and dealt with. Really tried to think through. One of the things that, I don't think that we would claim that what was unique was the position that he was in and the resources he had and the sort of plethora of strategies that he deployed to bolster the South and to make possible the type of post-war settlement that he envisioned. Some of that, and what we try to do is to demonstrate, to show his agency in that, because this is another concern of ours, is that these losers were not simply vanquished, but that they actually had agency, and how they lost was instrumental or very important in the success of their subsequent policies and agendas. So just as we talk about Johnson trying to, or repurposing anti-federalist rhetoric to defend his interpretation of the Constitution in ways that promoted Southern aims, we also talk about ways that his articulation, things like race-neutral individual rights, are also then subsequently echoed by Southern politicians all through the Jim Crow years up until the 1960s.
Yeah.
And so we're sorry.
No, go
What
ahead.
we're interested in doing is showing that there is a kind of a lineage there that, just as he repurposed anti-federal language, he then provided resources or fortified resources that may have been deployed by other Southern politicians for future articulations down the historical road.
Yeah, it's interesting about the race-neutral Constitution. My memory of the first time that appears in a Supreme Court opinion is the dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson. Justice John Marshall Harlan advances the idea of a race-neutral Constitution. Do you think he was influenced by Johnson? That's
an interesting question. I think that I'm hesitant to say anything definitive. What I think that we're trying to suggest is that there is a kind of semi-coherent strand of constitutional interpretation and constitutional thinking that actors at different points can draw on. And so I'm hesitant to make an assessment in that particular instance, but I would say that is consistent with the type of reading that we see happening by politicians, including progressives like Woodrow Wilson on through Southern Democrats in Congress in the 1960s.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's interesting as well. You're thinking about Jim Crow, the arrival of Jim Crow. I mean, various factors contribute to that. It seems to me a major one is the so-called civil rights cases of 1883, which really guts the Civil Rights Act of 1875 as it applies to private institutions under the 14th Amendment. And interesting there, Harlan there is the one dissenting voice urging for state action and the preeminence of always of government power when we're talking about state institutions. I just think all of that coming together with Johnson's arguments, those are some thoughts that I had. Maybe we can talk here at the end about Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, and as you say, their debt to the Anti-Federalists.
Yes, yeah. So the Barry Goldwater case is, in some ways, that is a more familiar story. Certainly, we're not the first to say that his 1964 defeat, nonetheless, presaged the. No,
I've read the Rick Perlstein book that came out. Was it maybe 15 years ago now? On the Goldwater camp. That was a great book. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're indebted to that book as well. But I think what we try to show in the Goldwater case is that it wasn't just that he was, as is sometimes claimed, kind of a man ahead of his time, ahead of a harbinger of things to come, but that in fact it was the very features of his campaign and his persona that ensured his defeat that was instrumental in bringing about the future success. And that's, I think, our innovation. We call it the politics of integrity, right? That the ways that he lost, the ways in which he campaigned, the ways in which he lost, were essential to preserving a true conservative alternative to the New Deal that was then brought into mainstream Ronald Reagan.
It's interesting. There, I had a lot of thoughts. Something a lot of older conservatives have said to me. A crucial moment for them in recognizing Ronald Reagan's preeminence was the speech he gave on behalf of Goldwater's behalf and defeat. Yes. And that's when Reagan begins to emerge. It's interesting, and this isn't a part of your book, doesn't have to be, but thinking, one criticism the last couple of years has been made is conservatism itself became hidebound and ossified and became too much about a certain set of principles and ideas. The public, the voters, be damned. And as I was reading your book, I thought, if Tullis and Mellow are right, this might be where it comes from. This sort of there's a pure conservative integrity, and of course, as a well-known, Republicans have looked in numerous presidential contests until the last one for the next Ronald Reagan, and that was kind of silly in a way, but in a way, if I think about your claim, maybe not.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, with the case of Barry Goldwater is also interesting because one of the things that we suggest is that not only was he instrumental in bringing about the subsequent success, but it was a success that the legacy of which included things that he may not have necessarily been supportive of, right? So he's an interesting case. They're all interesting cases, I think, but there are interesting features of how he succeeded and the conservatism that he wrought, the success of the modern conservatism that he helped to bring about. What do you
see his in terms of Barry Goldwater's connection to the Anti-Federalists, what do you think are the brightest lines?
So certainly a defense of a limited national government power, of the sort of sanctity of state power, and really as a one of the things that so in these ways he finds sustenance in that anti-federal interpretation. But what is really, I think, important and significant about what Goldwater did was to reintroduce these ideas into a political moment in which the New Deal interpretation of the Constitution was the dominant one, right? That his was a really genuine conservative critique of the New Deal and the assumptions of the New Deal in ways that, at least in popular politics, right, in that sort of a platform of a presidential campaign. Certainly we're not there with Eisenhower. We're not there with Nixon. We're not there with Rockefeller, other prominent presidents and presidential contenders at the time. So what he did was to reintroduce into this kind of ideological and political dispute that has characterized American political history at a particular moment of inflection when the New Deal order was at its height. It's obviously past the sort of formal New Deal, right? But when the New Deal order was at its height, he introduces these ideas in ways that what we argue is that voters were not yet ready for, right? Hence his resounding defeat.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, he provided them with a pair of glasses, if you will, a way to think about the New Deal and a way to view its subsequent overreach, to use a word that has come up before under Johnson, more critically, and to be sort of then more receptive to the critique that came somewhat rhetorically with Nixon, but then more forcefully with Reagan.
Yeah, no, I mean, and you argue, and you quote, I think it's David Frum, these massive victories of the Democratic Party in 1964, which paves the way for the Great Society, and the Great Society overreach, because there does just seem to be a limit to what government can do, and the dysfunction that introduces under these programs, which becomes sort of powerful fodder in the 70s for the neoconservatives who constantly criticize this stuff. And then there's Reagan. Reagan famously says in his inauguration address, government is not the solution to the problem, it is the problem. Reagan, as you look and you see a connection with Goldwater and Reagan, to my mind, Reagan's appeal in the 1980 election, some of it is, maybe like 15 to 20% of Republicans is sort of the anti-government appeal. But it's also like Tom Paine rhetoric as well. And a lot of people have made this is like fundamentally unconservative rhetoric about, the horizons and what America's going to do. And it sort of sparked in my mind, what is Reagan's appeal in 80? Is it this? Is it Goldwater? Anti-Federalist arguments, maybe in part, but as at times I wonder, could just be its incompetence in government, dysfunction in government, a sense of malaise, to use a phrase in the 70s, to use Carter's phrase in the 70s. Is akin to, how does Margaret Thatcher get elected prime minister in Britain? I mean, in a way, what happens in the 70s in the United Kingdom is much worse than what happens here in terms of society losing confidence in the government. And sort of, another comparison, Bill Buckley runs for New York mayor in 1965. He gets 5% of the vote. He runs on a libertarian platform. In 1965, he runs on school vouchers in New York City. And he says, well, the 5% of the vote I got was from Staten Island, which is, the most conservative borough in New York. Yeah. But he says they didn't vote for me for my platform. They just thought I was a patriot. And I think that's kind of Reagan's appeal. So I just ask you that in closing.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting, and one of the interesting figures that we're not talking about, but who probably deserves mention is Nixon, right? Because I think what you say is right, and I think that the Reagan's appeal is broader than simply the fact that he's articulating a new Goldwater's agenda. But I don't think that that's incompatible with what we say, which is that you could have malaise, you could have sort of a sunny patriotism, and it could not be sufficient, right? That part of because the ideas would still be seen as though anathema to the reigning public philosophy. But I think what, both in suggesting that Goldwater helped to pave the way, not just through kind of educating the American public about some of the deficiencies of the New Deal, but also through the organizational infrastructure that developed to promote him, and through so I want to say that it's more than just ideas; it is also kind of infrastructural in ways that then, in tandem with the malaise of the 70s, with the sort of appealing attributes of Reagan's personality, all of that might have certainly probably contributed to Reagan's success. But I think the interesting figure is Nixon, because what Nixon does, right, from 1960 to 1968, is learns from Goldwater. He learns from other sources too, of course. But so on the one hand, by the time we hit 68, he is sounding decisively more conservative and decisively more like Goldwater in his rhetoric. But at the same time, over the next 6 years or so, he's also building national government power. And so there's this way in which he both contributes to the problem that Goldwater had identified for Americans, and yet offering up the solution to it, right, the critique of it, in ways that may have, in fact, hastened the readiness of the national audience for Reagan in 1980. So I think he's actually an interesting character for some of the sort of differing ideas in politics that he put out there.
Well, that's an interesting way to close. We've been talking with Nicole Mellow, co-author with Jeffrey Tullis of the new book, Legacies of Losing in American Politics. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.